Hey guys, this is your High Fist here with another juicy video. Now, as all of you know, many years ago I did say that I would do a video on Gothos Folly, and as my loyal subscribers, you all know that your High Fist is very rarely a man of his word. However, I do keep some of my promises eventually, so here's that video. Gothos's Folly isn't a very big part of the 10 big books. In fact, you could argue that Gothos himself plays a far more prominent role in the Karkanas books than in the main Malazan series. But his autobiography or treatise or book or suicide note or whatever you want to call it, this thing called Gothos's Folly, it's just one of those things which exists in the periphery of the Malazan world building and themes, and yet plays such a huge role in the big picture perspective of the series. Now, in many videos, I've discussed the blurred lines between history and fiction in the 10 big books. As all of you know, history is seen very differently by Steven Erikson than most fantasy writers. In most works of fantasy, the history of that world is simply used as a world building tool. Usually in fantasy fiction, if you hear, for instance, that the evil lord ruled for 5,000 years and that he was then killed in the year 5,000 by the child of prophecy in the great battle of the cliches, that's pretty much an accurate historical account of what happened in that world, in that universe. But the Malazan series is very different. You might hear one historian from a certain culture or continent tell us that X were the good guys and Y were the bad guys, and their big battle happened 2,527 years ago. And then you might see another historian somewhere else saying, oh, Y were the good guys and X were the bad guys. And their battle actually happened 20,000 years ago as opposed to 2,000. And then we might get a flashback to the actual battle itself where we see that there was no X or Y and that it actually happened 200,000 years ago. And that even those involved in it barely remember what happened. And then we might find out that the entire series was written by the crippled god. So even that flashback might have been a lie or a faulty memory or an exaggeration or something. So the point is that when we view Malazan history, we do it inside this universe in a radically different way from how we would usually view history in most works of fantasy or even science fiction. It isn't just that the narration is unreliable, it's the historical chronology that's unreliable as well. And this way, it also reflects how history actually works in the real world, in our world, where there is no consensus. There are at least a dozen countries, for example, claiming even today to be the world's oldest civilization. There are many wars raging even today where the histories of different countries or cultures will view the morality of it differently, or even who won and who lost differently. Take the Korean War as an example. Your idea of who won and who lost that war would depend drastically on whether you grew up in North or South Korea. So the point is that the 10 big books take this fickleness of history and it plays around with it. And the symbol of all this is Gothos's Folly. Even though you could argue that characters like Duiker play a much more direct role in portraying historians and all that, Gothos's Folly pervades all 10 books in a far more major way, if you ask me. So, the first time we hear it mentioned is very early on in the series. Even before the Siege of Pale, we see Hairlock telling Tatasale that Belladon is translating some scrolls from this ancient document called Gothos's Folly that was recovered from Black Dog Forest, right? And we see him say in these scrolls are mentioned the T Standi and other elder races. And immediately, as first time readers of Gardens of the Moon, this is where we fall into the conceit, the trap, the folly, if you will, of Gothos's Folly. Because at this point, We are only 50 pages into the 10 big books, and we have no idea that history will be played with in this way by Stephen Erickson. So we simply assume early on in our journey that this is world building and we move on. But then we see an excerpt from Gothos Folly later on in book one, and we see that it's written in this weird cryptic poetry type style. So it's far more open to external interpretation than we might have initially thought before the Siege of Pale. So Belladin's translation or extrapolation of this treatise might not even be accurate. And we then find out that Belladin himself thinks there are certain things which Gothos would never admit. So Belladin's Teloman Toblakai, right? And this poem that we see that I just mentioned is about the Toblakai as well. So Belladin's obviously been researching the history of his people, and he says, look, I have Jagut blood in me, but Gothos would never admit it. Gothos would never admit that the Teloman are part Jagut. As in, this historian whose work we are now using as the basis of history, he has his own prejudices and blind spots as well. And this brilliantly makes us as readers face the dilemma that real life readers of history have to face, which is the reality that all historians have their own prejudices. It could be racial, linguistic, sexual, philosophical, whatever, but everybody's worldview is tainted in some way by who they are. So, do we now cast aside what they say completely? Or do we try to wade through their prejudices like a swamp and collect whatever credible information we can from their historical accounts? That's a dilemma that all readers of history face, as I'm sure you know, since most of my subscribers are well read and well informed. And Erickson makes us confront this problem in book one of the series, where we now have to decide how much of Gothos we trust and how much of him we don't. Because this is presented to us as the premier historical account of the Malazan world at this point, and we are also told about Gothos's prejudices, little do we know that this encapsulates the 10 big books perfectly. Because once you finish the series, you as the reader must now decide how much of Caminsaw's account in these 10 books actually happened. How much of it was either overstated or straight up fabricated by the cripple god simply because it would make for a better story. We hear about Gothos' folly again in book 2, where Marpo and Icarium have a debate about the nature of civilization and knowledge and blah blah blah. And Marpo makes a very interesting point about how jaded intelligent people can sometimes be. This is the exact quote, I have it in my notes. Gothos' curse was in being too aware of everything, every permutation, every potential, enough to poison every scan he cast on the world. It availed him not, and worse, he was aware of even that. End quote. So, what Mapo is saying here is look at what happened to poor Gothos. He knew so much and he was so smart and so knowledgeable that no matter where he looked, he could see all the possibilities. And this poisoned his entire worldview. He had too much knowledge, and that he wrote Gothos' Folly knowing this, knowing that he was cursed with having too much information and that this whole thing was an act of folly. And I found that so interesting because this once again presents us with another encapsulation of the Malazan series. A lot of readers complain that they have no idea what's going on in these books, right? That the series is too confusing, there are too many pieces of the puzzle that fall apart or are too far apart, and that nothing is clearly explained. But Mapo's point about Goto is this: do you really want it that way, dear Malazan reader, right? Like, do you really want to know everything about everything? Do you really want to be so knowledgeable about everything in the Malazan universe that no matter what you look at, you already know what the answer is? Because if you do, then what happened to Gothos will happen to you too, where you're no longer able to see the magic and awe of this Malazan world. You no longer have the ignorance that's necessary to have that bliss of wonder. It's a complete subversion of the typical knowledge is power truism that we get from fictional historians and scholars all the time, right? And it reflects the way in which Malayan history has to be sort of viewed very skeptically in order for us to enjoy it. But that doesn't mean that Gothos's Folly is just used by Stephen Erickson in these books to confuse us, because it's also used as an effective world building technique to give us vital information about the story. As I said, in books 1 and 2, we find out about the teist races through Gothos's Folly. And in book 3, it's through Gothos's Folly that we hear the names Kachen Chamal and Kachen Naruk for the first time. And here again, I need to dive in a bit deeper because those two instances are interesting as well. So in book 3, we first see a passage from someone called from something called My Endless Travels, written by some guy called Esley Monot, which sounds suspiciously like Esselmont, where he says that the only name we have for this ancient reptilian race is Kachen Chamal, as per Gothos's Folly. And it's funny because this guy describes the treatise as a hoary tome, and it's clear that he has no respect for it. He even calls it quote unquote utter nonsense because it's too grandiose for him to comprehend. And here again, we see how Gothos's Folly is really used to give us a sense of that historical fragility in this world. In most fantasy series, history, as I've said, is simply used for plot exposition, and we never get the sense that there's an actual academic discipline out there which many different scholars from different generations and epochs and cultures have contributed towards. And seeing one historian here from one generation critiquing a historian from several millennia ago and casting aspersions on him, just like what modern historians do all the time to ancient historians. That really deepened the sense of history in these books, where Erickson really makes us feel that this is a scholarly field in this work, in this world rather, which has been pursued by people from different places and eras. And then later, we also hear from Callor that it was Gothos's Folly which records the story of the Kache Naruk as well. And what's interesting here is that Callor says he has the only copy of it. So even though Gothos recorded the history and has theories about the Kache Naruk, nobody knows about it because Callor has hoarded the last existing copy of that. If we were to draw parallels to the real world once again, look at how so many ancient documents we have a certain perspective of simply because of what survived and what didn't survive. Look at Christianity, for example. Look at the biblical canon. The Council of Rome in 300 or 400 BC, the Councils of Carthage in 400 AD, the Council of Trent in 1545. These were all instrumental in determining what we view today as the Bible. Out of many existing documents, various councils through various eras have picked and chosen until they settled on what the accepted canon was going to be. And if some other texts had been included and if some familiar ones had been excluded, that might have led to a completely different religion over the centuries than what we know about Christianity today. And similarly here, someone in the Malazan world can read Gothos's Folly and go, this is useless and unreliable because there's no mention of the Naruk here. But the truth would be that Gothos did indeed discuss the Kachen Naruk, but because parts of it are missing, whatever canon you create of Gothos's work as the definitive edition of Gothos's Folly, it's going to be missing vital pieces simply because it was written so long ago. And it's so logical for Callor, being an Ericksonian nihilist, as we've discussed in another video, to do something like this, because to him, the writing of histories is meaningless. He might respect it as an intellectual pursuit, or he might respect it as powerful information to be kept secret, like what he does with the Naruk information, but he would never admit that there was a point or a higher meaningful purpose to it. And this also goes to show that history is more often than not decided by the people who compile history rather than those who write it. You might have written about some significant historical event, right? But if it isn't included in the canon of whoever compiled your work, or if someone chooses to hoard your work, it all becomes pointless. And Kalos, seeing all this way back in book 3, only makes their inevitable confrontation in book 8 all the more enjoyable. So we don't really get much about Gothos's Folly in book 4, but then he appears in person in the prologue of book 5. And what do we see him doing here? We see him freezing history. We see him being asked by an elder god to quote unquote freeze time itself. And I thought this was very interesting because isn't that what Gothos's Folly is supposed to be, even though it's not? It's supposed to be a document which gives us this objective, singular, solid, frozen piece of history, but it doesn't give us that at all. It just gives us this blurry, subjective, ironic record of history where you have no idea what to believe. And that's precisely what happens when he freezes letter as well, right? History is supposed to remain frozen and singularly preserved with his ice magic, but it eventually melts away and the old ghosts of the past return, both literally and metaphorically, because no piece of history can remain frozen in time forever. And let's face it, it's also a really cool scene where we see a historian whose job is to metaphorically freeze history on a page, literally freezing history by covering large parts of an entire continent in ice and trapping time itself within it. Gothos's Folly is mentioned twice in Book 6, both times by Banisha. He says that the treatise does not, it mentions the matron of decay, but that she's also mentioned by half dozen other names in Gothos's Folly. And here again, let's look at how Erickson picks out things about history that most other authors of fantasy and science fiction don't. In most works of fantasy, even though it's supposed to be epic fantasy, you often see historical figures in that world being referred to by the same name across cultures. But that's simply not the way culture works. As I've pointed out in my channel many times before, there are a number of names which refer to the same person, but the name changes based on the diction of that culture. So Ibrahim and Abraham refer to the same person. Solomon and Sulaiman refer to the same person. Alexander the Great is known as Sikandar in the Persian rendition of his name. Jesus is known by many different names in different languages. So how often do we see this in epic fantasy, though, where these singular historical names exist everywhere? But in the Malazan series, it's obviously different. You might call him Rake in one culture and Purake in another. Your name might be Osirk in one culture or one epoch and Osirik in another. And this instance is a slight nod to that Gothos's Folly, where he has different names for the goddess, because a true global account of history, especially when you speak about a religion or a goddess like the matron of decay, would often refer to the same individual by different names. I thought that was a nice touch. We see Gothos again in book 7, where we go back to the prologue of book 5, and he tricks Mael and Kilimandros into letting him keep the finest and all that. But what's really interesting is later on in book 7, when the errant thinks about Gothos, and he refers to Gothos's Folly as a suicide note, which is a great analogy for what it is. It is a historical treatise, but it has this melancholic irony to it, almost like a guy writing down his life and his regrets before he ends everything. And that analogy really works for Gothos's Folly, which is what makes it even more intriguing. In book 8, he obviously plays a huge role. One of the first mentions of Gothos's Folly is this great quote, which is in a scene. I think it's a conversation between Raist and Ralik Nom. And Ralik quotes, or Raist quotes Gothos' Folly. And the quote is, "He who rises shall fall. He who falls shall be forgotten." End quote. This is that line. Think about that, right? It's so simple and yet so profound. He's obviously written this not just in the context of race, not just in the context of Jagut tyrants, but Gothos has written this in the context of any structure of power. So let me reread that quote because it's important. "He who rises shall fall. He who falls shall be forgotten." As in, no matter how high you rise, you will eventually fall. And once you fall, you will be forgotten. So, no matter what great heights you reach, you will eventually fall just like the rest of us, and you will eventually be forgotten just like the rest of us. And this is another great insight into why it's called Gothos' folly. Folly, as in an act of foolishness. Gothos knows that a comprehensive, cohesive history is not possible, that it's idiotic to even think it's possible, but he still does it. He knows that no matter how good the history is, it will eventually be forgotten someday because everything that rises will fall and everything that falls will be forgotten. But he still does it, knowing that. He knows that he knows too much to enjoy the process of historical research, as Mapo points out, but he still does it. This is all one big act of stupidity on his part. For him to even do it being aware of it, it's an act of folly, right? And that's why it's called Gothos' Folly. He has great interactions with both Calo and Nimander's group in Book 8. And from a world building standpoint, he gives the readers information about the blood of dragons and all that in Toll the Hounds. We don't see Gothos mentioned much in Book 9. Although, for us Quick Ben fans out there, do take note that there's this really weird line in Book 9 where Quick Ben says Gothos knows who he is. Yes, he says Gothos saw through the disguise. When did Gothos and Quick Ben meet? Who knows? Was it in the timeline of the 10 big books or a long, long time ago? Nobody knows, but all of this obviously makes Gothos even cooler. And in book 10, we get a few mentions of Gothos' folly again. We get an excerpt, this time some kind of translator's note to some old translated edition of Gothos' folly, which is supposed to be from 835 Burn Sleep. So it's about 300 years, I suppose, before the prologue of Gardens of the Moon. We get this, after that, we get this weird poem, which may or may not have been written by him. And we then get a hilarious and weird quote from Gothos' Folly at the start of chapter 21 of The Crippled God. It just says, "He was not a modest man. Contemplating suicide, he summoned a dragon." End quote. What's he talking about? What's his dragon that he's summoning? Who is this guy? Why is he contemplating suicide? Is he referring to Gothos himself? Who knows? But it's a funny line nonetheless. And the last final mention of Gothos' folly in the 10 big books is what started this video. As you know, I did a Folklore Assail video a long time ago, one of the first to be shared by Stephen Erickson, and I discussed the scene between Brother Diligence and Sister Reverence. And it's where I mentioned that I will do a separate video on Gothos' folly. And here we are almost 3 years later, right? If you haven't seen that video, check it out. I still think it's one of my stronger videos in terms of analytical content, if not in audio quality. But for those of you who haven't, let me just discuss that scene here again because it's simply superb. So these two senior Folklore Assail are discussing a lot of philosophical shit, mostly about how awesome the Folklore Assail are, and they're discussing the Malazan army that's currently marching towards them in this desperate attempt to recover the crippled god's heart. Sister Reverence says, I can't believe their audacity for them to even think that they can do this, because even before they arrive, their doubts and mistrusts and all that would have already defeated them, because obviously the folklore are mentally unassailable and their army is just mind control, right? So their army isn't as psychologically vulnerable to things like mistrust and confusion and all that as the incoming Malazans would be. But as she says this, Brother Diligence suddenly says, in a war between fanatics and skeptics, the fanatics win every time. And Sister Reverence looks at him like, what the fuck did you just say? And he says, oh, look, we found this thing called Gothos Folly, and I've been kind of reading it. And she tries to argue with him by saying, look, we are not fanatics. We are too flawless to be fanatics. We are too wise to be fanatics, blah, blah, blah. And Brother Diligence once again quotes from Gothos Folly and says, when wisdom drips blood, fools stand triumphant, end quote. As in, when warmongering is considered wisdom, only the fools win. And Sister Reverence has no answer for that. She just says, burn those scrolls and never mention Gothos's folly ever again before she leaves in annoyance. And I think that's a fantastic last mention of something in the series, because it encapsulates what Gothos's folly is. Ultimately, Gothos's folly is not just about Gothos's folly, it's about all our follies. It's about the folly of life, the folly of history, the folly of time. It's about the excuses that the strong give to crush the weak. It's about the mistakes that all civilizations are doomed to repeat. It's about the ironies that are always inevitable with life and death. So, why did he do all this? Is it because of his history? Because we know from the Karkanis books now that he is a lot more deeply intertwined with what was once Jagut civilization than we previously thought. So did he do it because of that? Or is it because as a Jagut he simply found it funny to do something dumb and to name it Gothos's idiocy, Gothos's folly, whatever? Either way, Gothos's folly remains one of the most interesting and thought provoking elements of the 10 big books, which exists, as I said earlier, in the periphery of the world building, but manages to elevate the world building at the same time. And that brings us, dear subscribers, to the end of our discussion. This is your High Fist. I hope you guys enjoyed that video. Take care, and I'll see you soon.